Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 25 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Columbus Blue Jackets, in which the Sharks have lost 6-4. And the major story of tonight's game has to be the Sharks goaltender Adin Hill, because he just puts up a not nearly good enough performance in tonight's game, gets outdueled by Elvis Merzlikins on the other side by the Blue Jackets, who didn't even have to be necessarily all that fantastic in tonight's game, and as such the Sharks ended up losing because besides a brief stretch early in the first period and a slightly longer stretch early in the third period, I would say the Sharks were the better team here tonight for about 45 to 50 minutes. And yet it just seemed as though the Sharks could not buy a save in this game. And so while the Sharks score 4, which this season has frequently been enough to win the game, they end up giving up 5 on a manned net, 6 if you count the empty netter, and so they lose. And as such, I have to discuss Hill here first. Usually in my reviews, I discuss the goaltender right near the end of the video after I discuss the forwards and the defensemen and all of that. But with Hill, I'm going to make a special exception here. So Hill starts a third straight game here in these last 3 games of the road trip. The first one he played, it was against the New York Islanders, put up a decent performance, didn't have to be that great, but was solid enough to get the win. In the next game against the Rangers, which was the Sharks' previous one, he actually played quite well, but got 0 goal support in that one, and the Sharks ended up losing 1-0. And I don't know if this was like revenge from Hill to decide, hey, how does it feel like if you don't get any goaltending support, like I didn't get any goal support, because Hill lets in 5 goals here, and 3 of those goals he was beat pretty cleanly on both Boqvist goals as well as the Cole Sillinger goal. These were ones that Adin Hill probably would like back. The Boqvist one was the first one was a nice slap shot, but one he could make the save on, very similar to the goal that was scored on him by Ryan Strome in the previous game against the Rangers. The second Boqvist goal, he does have to slide across, so this one definitely has a bit of a higher difficulty in terms of making the save, but still one you would hope he would be able to make the save on, or at least considering the situation, you'd hope to be him to be able to make the save on. And then the Cole Sillinger goal was on a 2-on-1, but the deal between a defenseman and a goaltender is that, hey, I'll cover the pass, and if the pass makes it through, it's on me, but you have to be able to make the save if the player takes the shot, and that's exactly what Sillinger does, and yet Hill lets it in. He gets beat cleanly on the blocker's side. The other 2 goals I don't have that much of an issue with. The Corrali one deflects, and the Roslovic one was on a breakaway, though Hill ends up getting completely deked out in that situation. But it's just not an acceptable performance when the Sharks come in. They play pretty well, definitely well enough to win and get 2 points or at least even a single point, and yet their goaltending lets them down in this one, and they end up leaving with 0. This was a game that's just so similar to games that the Sharks have played over the past few years when Jones was really struggling, a game in which the Sharks were dominant, they were playing quite well, and yet the goaltending, when they do have that brief defensive lapse, ends up in the back of their net. And then people say, oh, well, the defense is a big issue here. And yes, obviously, on some of these goals, you're hoping that they can defend better. You don't like to see Brent Burns go down that early on the goal from Sean Corrali. You don't like to see Erik Karlsson step up that aggressively on the goal from Roslovic. You don't like the defensive breakdown that led to the second Boqvist goal. But at a point, you need a save. The Sharks didn't get that. There was even a goal called off by the Blue Jackets. They scored with about 3 minutes left. Gustav Nyquist, another one that beat Adin Hill clean. Luckily, the Sharks ended up getting to call that one off for the offside, though I guess it wasn't even that luckily because the Sharks could not do anything else after that, and then the empty netter would come in. But just generally, not a good enough game here for Hill. To get quickly into how this game ended up going, first few minutes, it went for the first couple minutes, Blue Jackets controlled, then it kind of turned towards the Sharks, and the Sharks controlled most of the first period, but the Blue Jackets actually get the first goal of this game coming from Boqvist. But in the dying seconds of the first period, with about 2 or 3 seconds left, Bonino would score his 4th of the season to make it 1-1, and that would be the score heading into the second. Early in the second period, the Sharks would manage to tie it up off of a nice bounce off of Gustav Nyquist from Erik Karlsson to make it 2-1, but it would be quickly tied up by the Blue Jackets this time to make it 2-2. The Sharks would get the lead back once again, going up 3-2, but again, it would be tied up by the Blue Jackets. It would go 3-3, and we'd head into the third period tied at 3. And so we would go into this last period of this 5-game road trip that the Sharks are on. You're hoping that they'd be able to come out firing. They'd be able to use all of the gas left in their tank to try and put up a good performance, try and get the 2 points here, and then head home to San Jose. But that didn't end up being the case, and it's kind of rare that we see this from the Sharks. This season they've had some bad starts, some bad first periods, they've had some bad second periods, but usually their third periods have been rather solid. Obviously there are times where they have a lead in the third period and then kind of let up a lot of shots, but that's not necessarily a huge deal. But here tonight, this was a game that the Sharks were tied in and then just came out looking like they were not ready to play this third period. The Blue Jackets are able to add 2 goals to their total early on in this third period within just the first few minutes to make it 5-3. The Sharks would eventually get 1 back from Hertl to make it 5-4, but that would be doing it for the goal scoring, and eventually Texier would get the empty netter. Moving on to the offensive side of things, these were the lines that started off the game, though as it went on, there was a bit of line juggling going down. So at first we had Meier, Couture, and Dahlin together. Meier, I thought, once again was one of the best Sharks players of the night, set up a ton of opportunities for himself, ended up with a couple of assists in tonight's game. Those secondary assists still did make an impact on the ice. Probably could have had a goal or 2 for himself or set up another couple of goals, but just generally, Meier continues to be the Sharks' best player thus far this season. When it comes to Logan Couture, he actually had an uncharacteristic off game for himself. Probably the worst forward here on this top line, because I did think Dahlin actually looked pretty good. Couture just not really doing much of anything on this top line, and so he actually ended up, I guess you could say, getting demoted as he swapped places with Tomas Hertl. And this is the first time, if you consider that the Meier, Couture, Dahlin line has been the first line since the beginning of the season, this is the first time that Couture has actually dropped off the first line, if I'm not mistaken, thus far this year. So definitely a bit of a message sent by Bob Booner. And like I said, Jonathan Dahlin actually a pretty solid game, had a very nice pass that led to the Tomas Hertl goal that did get the Sharks to within 1. On the second line, we actually had an injury to Balcers in tonight's game, and as such, Noah Gregor would take back his spot on the second line with Hertl and Barabanov. I was a bit surprised by that because I thought that the chemistry between Gregor and Bonino on the third line was actually developing quite well, and I would have been a bit more interested in, I would have liked a bit more to see maybe Kevin Labanc get an opportunity on the second line. Yes, I know Labanc has done pretty much nothing over the past few games to be deserving of that much of a promotion to the second line, but the fact remains that in this bottom 6 for the Sharks, the most offensively gifted player in that bottom 6 still is Kevin Labanc. And so if you don't want to modify that chemistry that Gregor and Bonino had been accruing over these past few games, I felt like it would have been made the most sense to get Labanc on that second line, but I don't have a huge issue. I thought Gregor was once again a pretty effective forward for the San Jose Sharks, especially early on in this game. I'd say Gregor's play fell off a bit as the game went on, but definitely early on, Gregor was one of the better players for the San Jose Sharks, which has definitely been nice to see. When it comes to both Hertl and Barabanov, I thought they had slightly above average games just because generally the Sharks played quite well as a unit for tonight's game. I don't think Hertl or Barabanov's performances were blowing me away and making me think like, wow, this guy had a great game like I said about Timo Meier earlier, but I don't think they were particularly bad either. When it comes to the third line, another player returning to the lineup here was actually the player returning to the lineup here was Cogliano, as he comes back onto the third line with Bonino, and he is joined by Matt Nieto, of course, taking the spot of Noah Gregor, who moved up to the second line. Cogliano, Bonino, and Nieto, this line actually looked pretty good. Cogliano had a couple of great chances, one early on I believe 2-on-1. He receives this pass, but he roofs it over the net, unfortunately. But in the end, this line ends up combining for the goal near the end of the first period that tied the game for the Sharks, so they certainly did their job in tonight's game. Bonino has just been looking a lot better since he really got the monkey off of his back with that first goal of the season, because it felt as though early on in this game he was much more of early on in this season, I should say, Bonino was at times just an offensive black hole where plays would go to die. I still remember the horrors of watching Nick Bonino on the first line with Couture and Dahlin. So it's definitely nicer to see on this third line now actually doing a pretty good job, going head-to-head with other teams' third lines and sometimes winning that matchup and being able to chip in a goal here or there. When it comes to the fourth line, really not super effective, I would say. Kevin Labanc, we saw at times getting some shifts in the third period with some of the top players, so getting shifts with Meier, getting shifts with Hertl, but he didn't really do much with those few opportunities that he was given. When it comes to his two other line mates, Weatherby and Peterson, you could have told me that these two players didn't even play tonight, and I probably would have believed you, which is the usual thing I say when two players or a player don't really make much of an impact on a particular game. When it comes to the defensive side of things, for the defensemen, I was definitely quite impressed with the offensive games of both Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson. Obviously, there were some defensive issues between those two players as well. Like I said earlier on, Karlsson had the poor pinch that eventually led to the Roslovic breakaway goal. Brent Burns goes down a bit too quickly on the Sean Kuraly goal. Obviously, Brent Burns likes to, go down on the ice to try and block those passes, but I would have liked him to stay on his feet for maybe the extra half second or so to allow his team to get back in the play before he then does that patented Brent Burns play. But on the offensive side of things, both these players were setting up a ton of chances for themselves. Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson actually both had goals here tonight. I thought Erik Karlsson, more so than Brent Burns, was even more of an offensive force here tonight. Erik Karlsson has just been looking very impressive on the offensive side of things over these past few games. The defensive side of things obviously can still use some work. Like I've said many times with Erik Karlsson, you're kind of just hoping things can go more well than poorly, and that's, I would say, what happened here tonight. I will mention once again here when it comes to this bottom pairing for the San Jose Sharks, as Simek was back in the lineup here tonight over Milosh after he missed the game against the New York Rangers. I wasn't super blown away with their performance. There were a couple of moments where I thought Vlasic definitely could have made a better play. The same goes for Simek. The fact is, when it comes to this bottom pairing, I'm kind of just hoping that they can give the Sharks a good 12 to 15 minutes of ice time when they're on the ice, and there have been games where they've been managing to do that. There have been games where they've actually looked rather impressive defensively, but they're just a few too many games thus far this season, and I'd say this is potentially one of those where it's just kind of average at best and, not so great at worst. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Calgary Flames for the second time this season, only their second game against a divisional opponent, I should say. In their first matchup, they actually managed to beat the extremely strong Calgary Flames team. They managed to take them out 4-1, though this score a bit misleading because the Sharks ended up with 2 empty net goals in that one. It was a 2-1 game prior to that, so technically a 1-goal game decider. And so we'll see if the Sharks can actually put up as impressive of a performance as they did in that first meeting against the Calgary Flames here for the second meeting, and hopefully James Reimer will be feeling a bit better and can actually take the start away from Adin Hill, who after tonight I may not want to see him for at least a few more games. Class dismissed.